Hello, everyone. We're excited to be talking to Scott Stiles today. He's the CEO and founder of Fair Employment Agency. He's working to end slavery by reinventing the whole model for domestic help in Hong Kong. So stick around. You don't want to miss this episode.
Welcome to Your Mark on the World, bringing you another changemaker with champion of social good, Devin D. Thorpe.
Scott, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's exciting to talk to you about the work you're doing. You know, one of the horrific problems of our modern age is the number of people who are living in slavery, and experts tell us that the number is likely to be greater than any time in history, and it's just tragic. And there you are, working in the thick of that, trying to figure out ways to reimagine domestic help so that women, especially from the Philippines, working in Hong Kong, aren't being enslaved by that process. But why don't you start by telling us how these women end up effectively enslaved in Hong Kong?
Okay, so basically what happens is people in the Philippines, Indonesia, some of these kind of more developing countries, they end up in situations of debt bondage because what they have dreams. They want to support their family. They want to send their kids to school. They want to build a house. And realistically, there aren't the job opportunities in their home country. And so they say, hey, I need to work abroad. And so they go to agents who say, no problem, I'll help you find a job abroad. You're going to be rich, right? You're going to make $500 US a month, which to them is oftentimes more money than they could have ever imagined making. But in order to get a job, you need to pay an agency fee to us of usually between 4 and 7 months of their salary, 80% of their salary for 4 to 7 months. And so what happens is these workers are falling into this cycle of debt bondage where they're doing everything that our society tells them to do to be successful, right? They're working hard, they're taking risks, they're leaving their families. And as a result of this debt, they can never really get ahead. And so when we saw that problem, my co-founders and I kind of saw this problem, we put together this business plan for how to attack it. And that's what we've done.
So let's talk about what you're doing. Yeah. So what are you doing to change those patterns to break that cycle?
Yeah. So, this is an interesting problem because this is completely solvable, right? So some world problems are far more complex. This one is not. This is a matter of you have employers who are oftentimes dissatisfied with the services that these agents, these kind of employment agents are providing. You have these workers who are oftentimes doing everything they can to get ahead. Like how hard these people are willing to work is just amazing. And you have these agents in the middle who are making money off of failure, because what happens for them is they're incentivized to create more churn many times. Because if I'm an agent and an employer fires a worker, I can charge another worker to go into that position. And so what had happened for a very long time is there's been this cycle of churn that had been created on the basically by these agents. And so our first kind of intervention point was to basically create an agency to compete with these guys who weren't doing a great job. And so we launched that about 3.5 years ago. And then our second intervention was to provide quality training. And we launched that about a year and a half ago. And now we're looking at how we become and how we kind of implement an agency on the sending country side to help change the system there as well.
It's fascinating. So are you charging the domestic workers up front?
So we don't charge the domestic workers any fees. We only charge employers.
And how do you, if the market is used to the employees paying, how have you made the switch to getting the employers to pay you?
Well, it's a really interesting thing. When we first started, that was the big question, right? And employers have always been paying. So they've always been paying something. But the shift is they are paying a little bit more now than versus what they used to pay. And we believe that needs to kind of continue to happen. They need to, in order for the market, for them to bear the true cost of migration, employers are going to have to pay more. But the funny thing is that if you're hiring somebody to take care of your child, your baby, or your elderly parent, or your dog who's like a baby, you are willing to pay a little bit more to get the right person in the job, right? And to get somebody who's not debt bonded. And that's been one of the kind of the reassuring things to us, is that over and over again, we found that people are good. People want to do the right thing. They want to make good decisions. And so they're willing to pay a little bit extra based on what they paid before. And so, it's been a really straightforward process for us, because we basically said, hey, employers should be paying this. And over time, as they hear about our service and as they use us, they say, oh, this is totally worth it. They tell their friends it's totally worth it to use them. But we also haven't tried to blow out the market to where only kind of this top level can afford us as well.
How does the new model affect the lives of the people who are working in Hong Kong? They're still expected to do the same job. They work long hours. And it's not always pleasant work. Are you really changing their lives?
Yeah, I think so. Now, part of this is that, and part of what makes us successful is that we're not necessarily some sort of labor union, right? Our focus is on employees having choices, right? And so, we actually had a really good example of this just like this week. We had a worker who she went through our training center. She got into a job, and it wasn't working out. The conditions weren't right. They were pretty much unacceptable, to be honest. And she came back to us, and professionally, and part of our training is how you handle difficult situations, right? Because you can imagine the emotions of somebody who's just migrated, is away from their family for the first time, all these things that are happening all at once. But she, instead of kind of, having a very emotional response, she just came into the office and said, hey, there's these conditions that are unacceptable right now. Can you help me find a new job? And so she found a new job. Instead of being, months behind in debt, instead of basically costing herself a year's worth of salary once you're looking at interest payments and once you're looking at the debt that they actually accumulate, she was able to step away from that job that she was in. We found her a new job, and she's going to be starting her new job in just the next few weeks. And so that's where the model can really change, because you allow employees to leave bad situations. It's about them having choice, because you can't necessarily monitor every home, right? You just get creepy if you try to do that.
So you're giving them the freedom to choose, which also imposes on the employers the burden of having an acceptable work environment, an acceptable job description, because now the employees can just leave. They're not enslaved, in effect.
Yeah, exactly. But most employers want that, right? Most employers are good people. Most of these situations, but also most employers, what I say is most employers are good people and most people are bad managers, right? And so some of it is just tweaking the employer's perspective on how they manage this person, because it's incredibly weird to have somebody come live in your house, work in your house, take care of your kids. It's a very weird situation. And so a lot of times these employers, even there'll be kind of really negative stories that come out, but there's two sides to the story many times as well. And the employer just maybe wasn't looking at the management situation right. And maybe a worker responded in a way that wasn't appropriate. And so a lot of it is kind of walking them through that process. But we've seen, that anecdotally, the failure rate in this industry is about 35 to 40%. That's how many workers within the first several months are getting, turned over. Ours has been about 10% from day one. And so if just that headache for the employer of not having to go hire somebody over and over again is really worthwhile for them. And they've been really happy to oblige and kind of follow maybe a little bit higher level of treatment. But you get what you pay for in some ways. And what you pay for in this instance is often that payment is just respect, treating somebody, more respectfully, nicely, things like that.
So in the old model, if someone got fired in the first, say, 30 to 60 days with this big debt overhanging, what happens to that person?
So that person is going to typically go back to the agent who found them that job in the first place. And they'll say, the agent will say, oh, this is really a bummer. We'll find you a new job. Don't worry. All you need to do is go to the money lender down the street and pay us usually around $1,500 US is kind of a common number for that type of situation, between 1,000 and 1,500. No big deal. We'll help you. Right. And that worker, then they're just in this cycle at that point in time, right? Where they're just going to get, over and over again, kind of get hammered. And
Yeah,
so
they'll never get out of that cycle.
they
Yeah.
never really get out, right?
Because the money lender they went to wasn't Citibank. It was
No. I mean, 59.9% interest rates are kind of it's the most common number for these loans. And so that's where they just get, and the crazy thing about this problem is that this is what slavery looks like nowadays. Like this is actually it. When the UN, when the ILO and Walk Free did their report this year, they said 24 million people are in forced labor. The number one thing that they listed on there was recruitment debt. This is it, right? And so that's what makes me so excited is that when you look across this spectrum of what is solvable, this is so entirely solvable. Yeah. And employers want it too. And it's not just domestic work, it's big companies as well and factories, or it's, construction sites.
Yeah, sure, it's everywhere.
It's everywhere, right? But the interesting thing about it is that these big companies actually want to solve it. When we have conversations with them, and that's kind of the next progression for the business is doing some non-domestic, focusing on non-domestic work placements as well. And you talk with these big companies and they're like, oh yeah, this is ridiculous. These service providers don't provide a good service. We know they're debt bonding people. We're trying to do these kind of remediation mechanisms, but it's not scalable, and we're not able to operate our businesses like we want to, right?
Do I understand correctly that you're in the Philippines now, focusing on the training you give to the women who are migrating to Hong Kong to work as domestic servants?
So I'm in the Philippines now. We just moved down a few weeks ago, but we're focusing on taking control of the entire chain, right? So we're actually working with an employment agent here to try to basically go build up the business on that side. Because if we have the training center in place. So there's kind of 3 stages where you have the sending country agency, which is out there finding workers and bringing them in and then finding job orders overseas. And then you have the middle step, which is that training, which is preparing people to go and preparing them for migration. And then you finish up with, and then the last stage is the recruitment agency on the receiving country side. So we set that up first, and then we did the training center, and now we're looking at the agency. That way we can it allows a whole nother level of scale and to focus on different industries as well.
So are you able at each step to remove people who were in the past taking unfair advantage of the employees?
Yeah. And we do a vetting process. So, and the way I explain it, most people are good, right? And on the margins, you're going to have people who are bad. You're going to have employers who have malintent and, get some sort of power rush out of treating people poorly. And then you're going to have workers who are trying to abuse the system, right? So you have these marginal kind of groups. And then you have 25% of workers who aren't prepared to be here, right? They went through training that wasn't acceptable. They weren't vetted properly. They just aren't prepared to migrate, right? And then on the other side, you're going to have about 25% of employees. So you have 5% that have maybe malintent, 25% that are not prepared. You then have 25% of employers who are unprepared to manage, and then 5% that may have some malintent. And so you end up with, in the end, 60% of those matches are going to have some problems and some conflict there, or 50%, something like that. But there's very few that are actually trying to create problems, right? And so our focus is how do we get those 25% of workers who are unprepared and get them ready to go, so they're actually ready to migrate. And then with the employers, we do the same thing. And so we actually do trainings with employers on basically fair and ethical hiring and basic management, right? And the focus of that is not to sit there and say, hey, you should be extra nice. You should give more bonuses. It's nothing that we tell people to do costs them more money. It's basic management principles of gratitude, of making sure that you're communicating clearly. And when you do those sorts of things, you have better results. And what happens is, I went to a training once, or I provided a training once, and a lady came up to me afterwards and said, hey, I had 16 people that worked on my home before I had one that finished a contract. So this is a serial firer of mm-hmm. domestic workers, right? That's a pattern, right?
Yeah.
And when at the end of it, she said, but I realized that I was hiring using bad agencies that were incentivized to create that churn, and I wasn't managing properly either. And she ended up being a very big supporter for our company. She wanted, when her son was on back for a summer, she's like, hey, you should go volunteer with them. And so you get those people who, they're really good people. They're great people. They just have not looked at this the right way. And so we do some vetting, and we also do some kind of bringing along of people to kind of help them understand.
Describe the training you're doing in the Philippines.
Yeah, so the focus of the training, the way we say it is it's not just a job, it's your life, right? And a lot of times when you hear about technical training, it's around some sort of technical skill. It's, for domestic work, it would be laundry, it would be mopping the floor, it would be some cooking, and the reality is that every home does those things a little different, especially when you're looking at cooking or childcare and things. And so the focus for us is how can we make people successful migrants, which it doesn't necessarily mean that they're the best floor mopper ever, right? That's not usually going to determine what gets, if you fire somebody or not. And it's not a matter of knowing everything perfectly. It's knowing when to ask questions, how to communicate. So the way that I like to explain this to people is people don't get fired because they don't know how to wash every item of clothing in somebody's closet, right? They get fired because they don't know how to read a tag, and they're too embarrassed to, and so, the nicest shirt that an employer has is the one that of course is washed differently than everything else. And so the employer needs that item washed. And when the employee goes and washes it, they shrink it because it's supposed to be washed differently. But instead of feeling comfortable asking that question, instead of saying, hey, I made a mistake, they throw the item away thinking, okay, I'm just going to avoid this conflict. I'm going to avoid the problem. And the employer thinks that they're stealing from them, right? Because it was, of course, the most expensive item in their closet. And right. The reality is that little mistake becomes a catastrophe for their family, right? And so what we want to do is kind of bring that communication into line. And that's kind of one of the primary things. We also do a lot on the way of financial literacy and parenting from abroad, because these workers are they're lonely, right? And a lot of times they're working their tails off, and the family connection that they have can be fraught at times because they're unable to connect like they want to. And so there's a lot of focus on that as well.
What's the economic model for your training?
So that's the one that we're figuring out. The standard in the industry is that the worker pays for that. And I don't have a big problem with that as long as you're providing real value, right? As long as it's very different but a lot of times that can work as a rubber stamp, right? And so people are just paying for a rubber stamp that they need in order to leave the country. We're taking right now, we're going to be patient with that model and figuring out what the economics of it are. And so right now it's free for workers who are doing the training, or next to free. We're charging them for the basic, the facility fee, right? But that's kind of been the focus, because we want to really get the scale of that up so that we can show that an ethical training center can work at scale.
Right.
And we tweaked with different revenue models with it, but that's one where I think the real opportunity is working to set the standard, and then working with governments to say, hey, here's actually how the curriculum should be laid out. And the cool thing is governments are pretty on board with it as well.
Scott, I'm not 100% sure, but I'm guessing from your accent that you weren't born in Hong Kong or the Philippines. What took you there?
You are correct. So I went to BYU Hawaii, which is incredible. I'd highly recommend it. And I came to Hong Kong on an internship before my last year at university with my brother-in-law. His name's David Bishop. He's a social innovator in his own right. He's now my co-founder in this. And basically came out for a month-long internship with a nonprofit that he'd started. I was studying finance, and that's what I love business. The business side is what is far more kind of comfortable for me. And we talked about this problem with domestic workers, and talked about the agencies and the problems that they create. Being a good teacher, he did the thing where he made me think it was my idea. to kind of set up one of these agencies and be smart, did that when he'd been thinking about it for a while. And so I went back to school and I wrote up a business plan for it and I sent it out to him. He forwarded it to his network and it ended up with our other co-founder, who's named Tammy Baltz, as well as some people at Goldman who said, hey, we will fund you if you do this. And so I graduated, which was not the most entrepreneurial thing to do. So I did finish school and then I moved out to Hong Kong and kind of showed up, and the guys at Goldman were kind of like, whoa, you're pretty serious about this thing. I was like, yep, I got a pregnant wife at home. I'm dead serious. And they said, okay, well, yeah, we'll support you. And so they provided the initial funding to kind of get things going. And, from there, that was about 3.5 years ago that we launched operations. And it was, me, Tammy, my co-founder, and, one employee. And now that agency has a little over 20 employees working at it in Hong Kong. They placed 100 people last month. And we've placed, I think, 2,200 since we started.
Wow.
So we're one of the 5 biggest agencies for Filipino workers in Hong Kong.
Wow. So Scott, what is your superpower?
Superpower, maybe a stretch. I think that the thing that I'm probably best at is I think that I can get great people on board, and get them to really engage. I think I had those 2 co-founders, Tammy and David, and without them, none of this works, right? If I would have been this guy who says, oh yeah, I'm going to save the world, I'm going to do it by myself, none of it works. And the reality is, David, he's just brilliant, just super, super smart. And from a strategy perspective, from an ideation perspective, all that, he's just incredible. And then it comes over to Tammy, and Tammy is this, she's an accountant. So she had was a CPA, that was kind of her background. And if it would have just been me and David, none of it, it just wouldn't have worked, right? Because we couldn't have gotten ourselves organized enough to execute the business really well. And so, from the day I got off the plane in Hong Kong, I had these 2 co-founders that were amazing. Now, over time, we also met with a lady named Jennifer Meehan, and she was formerly the CEO of Grameen Foundation for Asia. And so she had this, she had a really amazing background. And so, I met her just a few days after moving to Hong Kong. And I said, okay, our goal is to get her to join our team, because if she will join our team, we're going to be fine. And so it took us about a year to be in a situation where she could join, just to get things set up and registered. But then she came and said, hey, I want to be part of this. And so she worked for us for free for 2.5 years, full time.
Wow.
Yeah. And so it's one of those things where you look at these pieces and you have different people that guide you through the different stages of the business. And then using them, they're in board roles, but very active, they're board members, but they're far more than board members. Those are co-founders. And so, that's where I think I've been most effective, is getting those people on board. And then we've, recently had somebody come on board who's gotten involved, and her name's Jo Oswin, and she was formerly the COO of PricewaterhouseCoopers in China. And so, has this amazing experience on the execution side, working with complex relationships. And so she recently joined us on our board just a few days ago, or a few weeks ago. And having her to kind of walk me through these next steps of the Philippines has been really helpful. And so I think that's probably what I'm best at, is kind of bringing people on board and then focusing on those skills that they can really help us. And then just building out a team, right? Because the team in Hong Kong that's been put together it's an incredible group of really talented people that are making real sacrifices for the cause that we're focused on. So I'd say that the superpower is probably that.
Excellent. Well, Scott, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. We really appreciate it and recognize how busy you are. Before you go, would you tell people just a little bit more about how they can learn more about Fair Employment Agency and how they can connect with you, maybe on social media?
Yeah, you can reach out to me, Scott Stiles. If you search me on most of the social media platforms, you'll find me. SCOTTSTILES. And I'd love to chat. You can send me an email at scott@faireagency.org.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, Scott, we wish you every success in helping to rid Hong Kong of the scourge of, slavery. So,
thank you.
All righty. Well, let's do some good.
Thank you for listening. This podcast was recorded via Google Hangouts on Air and is available at youtube.com/Devin Thorpe. Subscribe to this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes by searching for Your Mark on the World. Every weekday, Devin hosts a CEO, celebrity, entrepreneur, or other changemaker here on the Your Mark on the World show to inspire and prepare you to make your mark. Devin is a champion of social good, writing about, advocating for, and advising people who are doing good. He is a Forbes contributor who is a recognized thought leader in social entrepreneurship, impact investing, and crowdfunding. To book Devin as a speaker, visit devinthorpe.com. Learn more about Devin's work at yourmarkontheworld.com.